Last Tuesday at Fort Benning, the most secure intelligence network in the world was compromised. A single encrypted file stamp Sierra Tango 77, vanished from a server that technically doesn't exist. What the thieves didn't know was that their digital theft also triggered a silent analog alarm, one that hadn't been heard in half a century. He was a ghost long before he became invisible. To the young recruits at the infantry school, he was just Audie, the old man who swept the brass casings off the firing line and wiped down the rifles in the armory. They saw the deep lines on his face, the slight stoop in his shoulders, and the gentle tremor in his hand as he held a dustpan, and they saw a relic, a piece of living history maybe, but history nonetheless, something to be handled with a kind of gentle, dismissive pity. "Watch your back, Pop," a young private would say, jogging past without a second glance. "Mr. Murphy, you missed a spot over by Locker 3, a sharp-faced corporal would call out, pointing with a clipboard, his tone impatient. Audie would just nod, a quiet smile touching his lips, and shuffle over to correct his supposed mistake. He never spoke much, he just watched and worked. But his work was a language only a few could read. When he cleaned an M4 rifle, he wasn't just wiping away carbon. His gnarled fingers would trace the lines of the weapon with a diagnostic intimacy. He'd feel for a hairline fracture in a firing pin the recruits had missed, for the subtle warp in a barrel that would send a round a fraction of an inch wide at 300 meters. His movements, which looked slow and feeble to the young men, were a study in economy. No wasted energy. Every motion had a purpose, honed by a lifetime they couldn't possibly imagine. He watched them on the range, his gaze not nostalgic but analytical. He wasn't remembering his own youth, he was cataloging their weaknesses. The way a recruit's stance was too wide, tiring him out. The way another flinched a millisecond before the trigger pull. He was a human database of flaws hidden behind a gentle, grandfatherly facade. He was the quietest man on the base, and the most observant. While they saw a janitor, Audie was conducting the most thorough inspection the base had seen in decades. He just needed to find the one thing he was looking for. Sergeant Major Thorne was a man carved from granite and disappointment. With 30 years in the service, he'd seen every kind of soldier there was, from prodigies to phonies. He was visiting Fort Benning to observe the new training cycle, and his eyes missed nothing. As he watched a platoon go through marksmanship drills, his gaze drifted past the recruits, past the shouting drill instructors, and settled on the old man picking up brass. He watched Audie bend down. It wasn't the slow, pained creak of old age. It was a fluid, balanced motion, a perfect paratrooper's crouch that conserved energy and kept his center of gravity low. Thorne's eyebrow twitched. Odd. Then a recruit fumbled a magazine change, his hands clumsy with nerves. A drill instructor got in his face, unleashing a torrent of creative insults. From 20 yards away, Thorne heard the old janitor mutter something under his breath, so quiet it was almost lost in the wind. Slow is smooth, smooth is fast. It was a common enough saying in the special operations community, but the cadence, the specific rhythm of the words was ancient. It was a ghost on the airwaves. Thorne's head snapped toward Audie. He looked closer, his expert eyes scanning for details. And then he saw it, the old scuffed wristwatch on Audie's arm. It wasn't worn on the outside of his wrist like a normal person. It was strapped to the inside, the face protected, hidden, a simple practical measure to prevent the sun from glinting off the crystal and giving away a position. It was a signature, the signature of a unit that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. Thorne felt a cold dread mixed with a shocking, profound sense of awe. Later that evening, the armory was silent save for the rhythmic slide of a cleaning rod down a rifle barrel. Sergeant Major Thorne entered, his boots making no sound on the concrete floor. Audie didn't look up from the M4 receiver he was meticulously wiping down. He sat on a low stool, the picture of harmlessness. Thorne stood there for a long moment, the silence stretching between them. Finally he spoke, his voice low and tight. "That phrase you used on the range, slow is smooth. And the watch, I've only seen one unit wear their watch on the inside of the wrist like that. I thought they were all gone." Audie didn't stop his work, he didn't look up, but for a fraction of a second his hands paused. It was an infinitesimal hesitation, a skipped heartbeat in the rhythm of his work. Then he resumed, but the motion had changed. It was no longer the careful work of an old man. His hands became a blur of practiced, impossible efficiency. The bolt carrier group, the trigger assembly, the charging handle. He reassembled the core of the rifle by touch alone, his eyes finally lifting to lock onto Thorne's. His gaze was like chipped ice. The gentle, vacant look was gone, replaced by an intensity that made the decorated sergeant major feel like a raw recruit. Audie's hand slid across the workbench and pushed a single gleaming, .50 caliber round toward Thorne. He tapped it once with his index finger, the sound a sharp crack in the silence. "Some things get left behind, Sergeant Major," Audie said, his voice no longer a frail whisper but a quiet rasp of authority. "Make sure you aren't one of them." It wasn't a threat, it was a command. Thorne, a man whose bark could make a full-bird colonel flinch, felt a knot of pure primal fear tighten in his stomach. He gave a short, sharp nod, his face pale under the fluorescent lights. The power in the room had just shifted, and the most dangerous man on the base wasn't the one with the stripes on his sleeve. Thorne walked out of the armory, a changed man. The next morning, Sergeant Major Thorne was seen speaking urgently on a secure phone line, his back to the wall, his voice a low, frantic murmur. An hour later, he was in the office of the base commander, Colonel Evans. Evans was a young, ambitious officer, a politician in combat boots who saw his command at Fort Benning as a stepping stone to the Pentagon. "It's a volunteer janitor, Thorne," Evans said, waving a dismissive hand. "An old-timer. Probably has some stories, but let's not lose our minds." Thorne leaned forward, his knuckles white on the edge of the colonel's polished desk. He said something, a few short sentences, too quiet for his aide outside the door to hear. Colonel Evans's confident smirk dissolved. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a waxy, horrified pallor. He stared at Thorne as if the sergeant major had just told him the sky was falling. The ripple effect was almost immediate. The atmosphere on the base began to change in subtle, unnerving ways. When Audie shuffled past the command building with his broom and dustpan, Colonel Evans, who was walking out, froze mid-stride. He actually flattened himself against the wall to let the old man pass, his eyes wide. A young captain, the same one who had impatiently told Audie to hurry it up with the trash cans a few days prior, now jogged ahead of him to hold open the door to the mess hall, stammering, "After you, sir." "Please." The recruits were the most confused. They saw what was happening, but they couldn't comprehend it. They watched as hardened drill instructors, men who seemed to fear nothing, would snap to a rigid brace when the old janitor walked by, only to relax into an awkward slump once he was gone. They started whispering among themselves. Who was this old man? Was he a secret billionaire? A senator's father? The speculation grew wilder with each passing day. Through it all, Audie Murphy remained unchanged. He swept the floors, he polished the brass fixtures on the doors, he cleaned the rifles. He seemed utterly oblivious to the silent, widening circle of fear and awe that was forming around him. His placid demeanor only amplified the tension. It was like watching a sleeping lion, knowing that at any moment it could wake. The mystery of the old man was no longer a curiosity. It was becoming a legend. The tension finally boiled over in the officers' mess. Lieutenant Fuller, a cocky West Point graduate with a jawline as sharp as his ambition, slammed his tray down on the table where Sergeant Major Thorne was sitting alone. "I want to know what's going on, Sergeant Major," Fuller demanded, his voice carrying across the room. "This entire base is walking on eggshells around a janitor. It's absurd. Command is paralyzed. What did you tell the colonel?" Thorne looked up, his eyes weary. He seemed to have aged a decade in the last 48 hours. He gestured for the lieutenant to sit. "Lower your voice, son. You're making a fool of yourself." "I want an explanation," Fuller insisted, though he sat down. Thorne sighed, the sound of a man tired of guarding a secret that was too heavy to carry. "You see an old man. You see a janitor. Your eyes work, but you don't see a thing. That watch he wears, on the inside of his wrist, that wasn't just a personal quirk. It was the uniform of a unit that officially never existed. In the late 60s, when an operation went so sideways that the agency and the military had to disavow it, they'd send in one man to clean it up. They weren't soldiers. They were ghosts. They called them watchmen." Fuller scoffed. "A ghost story. Is it?" Thorne shot back, his voice a low growl. "They were troubleshooters, sent in alone to prevent wars, to dismantle networks, to do the things no one else could. The official story is that the program was a failure, and the entire unit was wiped out in a black ops somewhere in Southeast Asia in the mid-70s. It was buried, but the legend always said one of them got out. The first one, the man who wrote their operational doctrine, the one they called Watchman 1. Thorne leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "His real name is Audie Murphy. The man you see sweeping floors single-handedly wrote the book on unconventional warfare that your professors at West Point are still trying to understand." Fuller stared, his arrogance finally cracking. He was silent for a long time. He didn't believe it, not yet. But the seed of doubt had been planted. The proof arrived the next day from the sky. The distinct thumping rhythm of a Black Hawk helicopter echoed across the base, a sound that always meant a visitor of profound importance. It landed not at the designated VIP helipad, but directly on the grass field next to Rifle Range 7, kicking up a storm of dust and dry grass. The entire base seemed to hold its collective breath. Out stepped a 4-star general, his uniform crisp, his shoulders heavy with responsibility. General Davies, the head of Special Operations Command. He strode across the field with an urgent purpose, ignoring the frantic salute of Colonel Evans who had run out to meet him. Davies walked right past the base commander as if he were a piece of furniture, and came to a stop on the firing line. He stood before Audie Murphy, who was quietly watching a group of recruits practice. The young soldiers looked on, confused. A few smirked, one whispering to his friend, "Looks like the old man is finally in real trouble." General Davies did not yell. He did not reprimand. He stood before the stooped janitor and spoke with a tone of the deepest, most profound respect, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "Watchman 1, we received your signal." The smirks on the recruits' faces evaporated, replaced by wide-eyed, slack-jawed disbelief. Lieutenant Fuller, who had been observing the drill, looked as if he had been struck by lightning. Davies turned to the assembled soldiers, his voice now booming with authority. "For those of you who are confused, let me be clear. The man standing before you, this man you know as Mr. Murphy, his service record is sealed above my own pay grade. He is credited with single-handedly preventing 3 separate wars, dismantling 2 international syndicates, and rescuing more high-value assets than any single SEAL team in the last 50 years. The man you have watched sweep these floors designed the very infiltration tactics your instructors are teaching you, and he found them wanting." He turned back to Audie. The power dynamic of the entire base had not just been shattered, it had been vaporized. The old man wasn't a ghost, he was a god. General Davis's gaze was fixed on Audie, the question hanging in the air, heavy and urgent. "Your signal, the Sierra Tango 77 protocol. It was a fail-safe, a break glass in case of Armageddon alarm. It hasn't been active in my lifetime. Why now, Audie? Why are you here? What do you need?" All eyes were on Audie. The frail, shuffling janitor was gone. He stood up straight, the stoop in his shoulders vanishing as if it had been a costume. When he spoke, his voice was clear and steady, a blade honed by years of command. "I'm not here because of something that happened 50 years ago, General," Audie said, his eyes scanning the faces of the stunned officers. "I'm here because of what happened last Tuesday at Fort Huachuca. The thieves think they stole a data file, an intelligence asset codenamed Cassandra. They're wrong." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Cassandra isn't a file full of data. She's a person, a cryptographer working on next-generation security for the agency." He looked directly at Davies, his expression hardening. "And she's my granddaughter. She didn't just let them take her. She hid a message for me inside the breach itself." A wave of shock rippled through the crowd. This wasn't about old history. This was active. General Davies stared at Audie, the implications crashing down on him. "A message? What message?" Audie reached into the pocket of his worn overalls and pulled out a small, almost ancient-looking data chip. She knew they were coming for her. She embedded a secondary payload in the exfiltration packet's ghost code, a list of names. He held up the chip for Davies to see. "The people who took her aren't in some enemy state halfway across the world, General. They're here." He swept his arm, indicating the entire base. "The breach at Huachuca was just the key. This place is the lock. Your base isn't just compromised, it's a cage." The rifle range, once a simple training ground, suddenly felt like the most dangerous place on Earth. Just as Audie finished speaking, a sudden violent movement broke the stunned silence. Lieutenant Fuller, the arrogant young officer who had mocked Audie just the day before, drew his sidearm with terrifying speed. But he didn't aim it at Audie. He aimed it directly at General Davies, grabbing the general's shoulder and pulling him close as a shield. "He's right, General," Fuller snarled, his face a mask of fanaticism. "The lock is here, and you just lost the key." Simultaneously, the digital targeting systems on the range sputtered and went dark. In the distance, a thunderous explosion rocked the base, a column of black smoke climbing into the sky from the direction of the ammunition depot. The theoretical threat had just become brutally physically real. The time for talking was over. Chaos erupted. Soldiers scrambled for cover, shouting in confusion and fear. But in the heart of the storm, Audie Murphy was an island of perfect calm. "Thorne. Perimeter. Davies, get down," he commanded, his voice cutting through the panic like a surgeon's scalpel. He moved with a speed that defied his age, shoving a heavy equipment table over to create a makeshift barrier. The mask was completely off. From a hidden, reinforced pocket inside his janitor's overalls, he produced a compact, suppressed pistol and a small, flesh-colored radio earpiece which he fitted into his ear with a practiced motion. Watchman 1 is active, he spoke into a tiny microphone on his collar. Protocol Chimera is in effect. All friendly assets rally to me. His transformation from a passive, overlooked old man to an active field commander was absolute and terrifying to behold. The recruits were frozen, paralyzed by the sudden violence. Audie didn't have time for their fear. He darted toward the nearest one and snatched the M4 rifle from his hands. It was the very weapon he had been meticulously cleaning in the armory just a day before. "Your stance is too wide, son. You'll get tired," he barked, his voice the familiar rasp of a drill instructor, reflexively correcting the recruit's terrified posture even as hostile rounds began to snap through the air. Fuller and 2 other soldiers, now revealed as traitors, were laying down a sheet of suppressive fire from behind a concrete barrier. Audie dropped to one knee, the rifle feeling like an extension of his own body. He didn't return fire wildly. He took a single measured breath, his cheek welded to the stock. Slow is smooth. Smooth is fast. Fuller was using the 4-star general as a human shield, peering around his side to fire. It was an impossible shot, with a high chance of hitting Davies. The loyal soldiers hesitated, unwilling to risk it. Audie showed no such hesitation. He aimed, his eyes calculating angles the way a mathematician solves an equation. A single sharp crack echoed from his M4. But the round didn't fly toward Fuller. It streaked down range and struck the heavy steel support arm of a target stand at the 100-meter line. The bullet, a 5.56 mm round, ricocheted at a precise calculated angle. It was a 1 in a billion shot, a geometric miracle of violence. The deflected round zipped back across the range and slammed into Fuller's firing hand, shattering the pistol and the bones holding it. Fuller screamed, a raw sound of pain and disbelief, and collapsed. The other 2 traitors, stunned by the impossible display of marksmanship, froze for a fatal second. It was all the opening Sergeant Major Thorne and the other loyal soldiers needed. The immediate threat was over. With the firefight ended, Audie stood up, ignoring the groaning traitors and the babble of shocked soldiers. He strode over to the whimpering Lieutenant Fuller, grabbed a handful of his uniform, and hauled him to his feet. The explosion at the depot was a diversion, Audie stated, his voice cold iron. A distraction for the main event. My granddaughter. Her transport was routed through there. You were moving her for final extraction. Where is she? Fuller, his face a mess of terror and pain, looked past Audie, his eyes pointing toward a concrete maintenance hatch set into the ground near the edge of the range. Service tunnel, he gasped, under the base, to the old airfield on the north side. Audie looked at Thorne, his eyes already tracing the path in his mind. They're moving her right now. We have to cut them off before they reach that airfield. Audie and Thorne, leading a small team of the most seasoned soldiers, descended into the dark, musty service tunnels beneath the base. It was a forgotten labyrinth, but not to Audie. He moved through the darkness with an unnerving confidence, using his encyclopedic knowledge of the base's old architecture to outmaneuver the extraction team. In a swift, silent confrontation in the echoing dark, they were neutralized. His granddaughter, shaken but unharmed, was safe. Back on the surface, under the blue sky, the base was secure. General Davies approached Audie, who now stood with his arm around the young woman he had just rescued. "Audie," Davies began, his voice thick with emotion, "the country owes you a debt it can never repay." Again, Audie didn't look at the general. He didn't look at the captured traitors or the grateful soldiers. He just looked out toward the horizon, his gaze distant, analytical. "This was just one cell, General. The network that did this is still out there." He patted his granddaughter's arm gently. "And the list she gave me is very long." The legend of the janitor was over, but the work of the watchman had just begun. If you believe in honoring the quiet professionals and unseen heroes who protect us, subscribe to Veteran Valor Stories. Like and share this story to ensure their legacy of courage is never forgotten.